So real quick, I just want to read a little bit of The Myth of the Jewish Menace by Lucien Wolf. He wrote this in 1920, so just a couple years after the Russian Revolution. And I just want to read one chapter of it. Just want to see how this goes. Might take too long, but we'll see. So this is chapter 3, entitled The Jews and Bolshevism. The final argument of the anti-Semitic scaremongers is the Judeo-Bolshevik bogey. The Morning Post theory of world unrest may prove difficult of assimilation to matter-of-fact minds, and the authenticity of the nihilist protocols may be suspect, but the Bolshevism of the Jews is asserted to be an uncontrovertible fact, which proves that both the theory and its documents are morally justifiable. Were it not for its very tragical possibilities, the evocation of this bogey would be a fit subject for mirth, or at best a problem for the folklorist or the student of corporate hallucination. As it is a very serious matter, seeing that the lives of many thousands of innocent persons are jeopardized by it. The bogey takes the specific form of a charge against the Jews of Russia and Poland that they are for the most part Bolsheviks, and that the Bolshevist revolution was engineered by them and is still controlled and directed by them. The only evidence cited in support of it is that Trotsky and a few of the more prominent Bolshevist commissaries are men of Jewish birth, and that a similar element on an even more restricted scale is found in certain of the Soviets. But those men are no more Jews than Lenin, Lunacharsky, Chicherin, and the great bulk of the Russian Bolsheviks are Christian. It would indeed be just as reasonable to say that the mainstay of Russian Bolshevism is to be found in American and British Christendom because it has found sympathizers in Mr. Bullitt and Mr. Stephens, in Mr. Good, Mr. Price, Mr. Russell, Mr. Ransom, Mr. Hunt, and many other Americans and Englishmen of Christian birth. The appearance of the bogey at this moment is not difficult to understand. There has always been at the back of the anti-Semitic mind an uneasy feeling that the Jews are, as the old law book says, perpetui inimici regis et religionis. Hope I said that right. Their participation in the bourgeois revolutions of 1830 and 1848 gave political point to this superstition, and ever since it has been a favorite theory of the more fanatical reactionaries that the whole democratic movement in Europe is a Jewish conspiracy for the subversion of Christianity and Christian society. In this respect, the Morning Post theory is, as has already been shown, not new. In Russia, it became early an expedient of reactionary tactics. To denounce revolution on its merits was difficult, but to denounce it as a Jewish conspiracy against the throne and the altar was always calculated to impress large classes of the population who otherwise might not have been indisposed to look indulgently on a great political change. This was the cue of all the incendiary appeals of the Okhrana against the revolution of 1905. Thus, when Bolshevism arose, it was quite in the line of traditional Russian policy to denounce it as the work of the Jews. From the reactionary camps of Denikin and Kolchak, and even from the Allied armies in the north, where the intelligence and propaganda services were necessarily in the hands of Russian officers of the old Tsarist regime. The country was flooded with pamphlets and broadsheets declaring that Bolshevism was a Jewish plot, and that the aim of those who were making war on it was not to fight their Russian brothers, but to deliver them from their Jewish bondage. It was, however, in Germany that the bogey was adapted for consumption in Western Europe. The old Junker anti-Semitism received a great impulse from the collapse of thrones which followed the armistice of 1918. All the revolutionary movements were at once attributed by them to the Jews, and by way of showing the victorious Allies the danger that they were courting by tolerating them, blood-curdling pictures of Russian Bolshevism as the first fruits of an international Jewish conspiracy were issued from the presses of the anti-Semitic society known as Deutschland's Erinnerung in Munich. A circle of Russian monarchist refugees in Berlin founded a weekly paper called The Sunbeam to help in the holy work. It was in the columns of this journal that translations of extracts from Nihilist's forced protocols first appeared. He's talking about the Protocols of the Others of Zion there. Early in 1919, the themes of these imbecile ephemerides were gathered up and coordinated in bulky volumes with Barons Hans von Liebig by Dr. Friedrich Fichtel and by a person calling himself Wilhelm Meister. These writers were the final artificers of the bogey as we now know it. Trotsky being represented in their pages as the conscious instrument not only of the Jewish rabbinate and of Jewish finance, but also of the secretly Judaized Masonic lodges. A curious restatement of this apocalypse will be found in an anonymous pamphlet entitled Le Bolchevisme, which was printed in Paris last year by the Jesuits of the Rue Garancière. The French, however, have been very loath to touch this unclean product of German Kultur. We need only glance at the leading tenets of the Bolsheviks to realize how stupid all this is. Indeed, how impossible it is that Bolshevism should find an even appreciable measure of sympathy in the Jewish community. Lenin, Trotsky, and their associates are not only extreme communists, but are also avowed atheists. On the other hand, the great bulk of the Jews of Russia are extremely orthodox members of the synagogue, who hold in horror every symptom of atheism. The strength of this element was recently estimated by M. Paderewski himself at 75%. In their economic affiliation, these Jews are not less hostile to Bolshevism. They belong in an overwhelming proportion to the upper and middle class bourgeoisie. Moreover, the Jew is instinctively and by all his traditions an individualist. It has been possible to found under the great names of Lamennais, Kingsley, Maurice Hughes, Bishop Kettler, and others, a school of Christian communism seeking its sanctions in the teachings of Orthodox Christianity. No such school, in the strictly economic sense, exists or is possible in the Jewish Church. Marx and Lassalle ceased to be Jews long before they became socialists. And insofar as the Jewish proletariat, which has arisen in Russia and Poland under the stress of exceptional and ephemeral conditions as socialistic, it is notoriously remote from the synagogue, as from every other kind of clericalism and impatient of its control. But it is said the Jews must be held responsible for Bolshevism because Bolshevism is only applied Marxism, and Marx was a Jew. I have already pointed out that, strictly speaking, Marx was not a Jew, but even supposing he were, that would not make Bolshevism a Jewish creation, seeing that in point of fact it is, in its main lines, not even Marxist. There is so much loose thinking on this question that it may be well to indicate, however, briefly, the fundamental differences between the teachings of Marx and Lenin. In the first place, Marx was a Democrat, while Lenin is confessedly an oligarch. Democracy is axiomatic with Marx. The foundation of all his doctrine. The foundation of all his doctrine. Lenin, on the other hand, derides the mere counting of heads. He is, as he would put it, for the supremacy of truth, whatever the number of its disciples. This vital difference affects the systems of the two men at all essential points. Thus, while Marx teaches that the dictatorship of the proletariat should be the outcome of a democratic republic based on universal suffrage, Lenin rejects universal suffrage and bases the dictatorship on a guild or Soviet republic. Again, Marx stands for revolution by law in all democratic states, while Lenin stands for revolution by force, whatever the constitution of the state. Nor does this apply only to revolutions, for while Marx holds that the authority of the state must, whenever possible, be exercised by peaceful means, Lenin teaches that force is inherent in the state and its exercise unavoidable. This leads Lenin to the view of Robespierre, that even the terror is in a sense mystically sanctified, a view of which Marx never dreamt in his most daring moments. Finally, the contrast, the conceptions of the state as set forth by the two men. Both, of course, are for the state, but while Marx pictures it, after the decision of the class war, as composed of the whole democracy seeking the conciliation of its conflicting elements, Lenin would confine it to the dictatorship of the proletariat, even though the other classes might be in the majority. There is, of course, much to be said for both theories within the ring fence of socialist polemics, but I am not concerned at this moment with their respective merits. All I want to show is that Marx cannot be held responsible for Bolshevism as we know it, and that if the alleged Jewishness of Bolshevism rests on the theory that has any essential affinity with Marxism, it is singularly unconvincing. The case against the bogey is, however, not limited to these generalizations. It may be said while the upper and middle classes in Jewry are probably free from Bolshevism, this is not the case with the Jewish proletariat. If not Orthodox Jews, they certainly profess a strong Jewish nationalism, and if from them Bolshevism draws its main strength, then Jewry must bear the responsibility. On this point, happily, very definite information is available. First, with regard to the leaders, Bolshevism was founded in 1903 through a split among the Russian socialists, which took the form of a revolt against Lenin, who led the revolt, the Jew Martov, and he was supported by all the most conspicuous Jews in the party, including Trotsky himself. They were followed by the great bulk of the rank and file of so-called Jewish socialists. How true this is can be shown by an analysis of the Leninite Party 14 years later. In the autumn of 1917, the Bolsheviks themselves published a statistical analysis of their constituents of the Soviets, with special regard to the geographical and ethnographical distribution. It was there shown that the Bolsheviks had a clear majority over the Mensheviks, or non-Bolshevist socialists, and that they were far more largely composed of pure Russian elements than the Mensheviks. Their greatest strength was found in the districts of Petrograd, Moscow, the Baltic provinces, the Volga, the Ural, and Asiatic Russia, where the great Russian working masses dominate. On the other hand, the Mensheviks were almost entirely confined to the western and southwestern provinces, the Don district and the Caucasus, where the chief non-Russian races are found. Here, the return for the Jewish Pale of Settlement, that is, the provinces in which 95% of the Jews of Russia and Poland reside, is most significant. The number of organized Mensheviks is given at 18,000, while of organized Bolsheviks there is no trace whatever in the whole region. The other non-Russian districts in these provinces were less fortunate. For in the southwestern governments, the proportion of Bolsheviks to Mensheviks was 8 to 11, in the Don district 18 to 29, and in the Caucasus 1 to 5. The statistics here, however, show clearly that the strength of Bolshevism was always in an inverse ratio to the strength of the local Jewish population. Another important piece of evidence is to be found in the attitude of the Jewish Bund, which is the main organization of Jewish workmen in Poland and the Pale of Settlement. From the beginning of the Russian Revolution, the Bund, avowedly socialist, threw all its strength on the side of the Mensheviks. The most passionate struggles on the Congress of Soviets in 1917 were those waged between Lenin, on behalf of the Bolsheviks, and Lieber, the Bund leader, on behalf of the Mensheviks. Lieber and his colleague Don were at that time among the staunchest supporters of the policy of the Entente in Russia. To this day, the great majority of the members of the Bund have remained anti-Bolshevist in doctrine, though under the pressure of the administration and for other political reasons, which have appealed equally to many ex-Tsarist generals and Christian conservatives, they have lately pledged their allegiance to the Lenin regime. In political thought, they are still numbered among the most ardent supporters of the great coalition of Russian Mensheviks, which has its headquarters in Stockholm, and another significant fact is captained by a Jew, the well-known socialist writer Paul Axelrod. There are probably quite as many Jewish leaders in the anti-Bolshevist coalition as there are Jewish commissaries among the Bolsheviks. Nor are the upper and middle classes of Russian and Polish Jewry merely passive spectators of the struggle. Politically, they belong in an overwhelming proportion to the moderate liberal party known as the Cadets, and many of them are active in the councils and press of that party. The present leader of the Cadets, who succeeded Professor Miliukov after his unhappy but temporary defection from the cause of the Entente, is a distinguished Jewish lawyer M. Venavir, equally conspicuous for his devotion to his co-religionists in the cause of ordered liberty in Russia. Admiral Kolchak and General Denikin, in spite of their compromising anti-Semitic associates, had no more strenuous supporter and no wiser counselor than M. Venavir, another eminent Jew who may frequently be seen in consultation with M. Sazonov and Maklov at the Russian delegation in Paris as Baron Alexander de Gunsberg, at one time the most conspicuous member of the Jewish community in Petrograd. The anti-Semitic impression that Bolshevism is largely Jewish is, however, not altogether a bad dream, but rather an optical delusion which has been maliciously exaggerated. The so-called Jewish Bolsheviks are indeed a corps of officers without an army, and the anti-Semites have a little too hastily inferred the army. Even then, these officers are not of the first rank. We have heard a great deal of Jewish commissars, and I find a notorious German anti-Semitic book quoting Mr. Robert Wilton of the Times as its authority for the statement that of 384 people's commissars who constitute the government, only 13 are Russians while 300 are Jews. What are the facts? The only officials in Soviet Russia who are authorized to hold the rank of people's commissars are the members of the cabinet. These numbers 17, and of them 16 are indisputably Gentiles, while only one, Trotsky, is of Jewish birth. And Trotsky, be it remembered, is a Jew who has publicly abjured the Jewish and all other religions, and who is so little a Jew in other respects that at the socialist congresses of the beginning of the century he led the cosmopolitans in denunciation of the Jewish nationalism of the Bund. To describe Russian Bolshevism as Jewish because one member of Lenin's Council of People's Commissars is an apostate Jew is obviously ludicrous. Lenin might far more justly describe the anti-Bolshevism of Western Europe as Jewish because 2 years ago the French cabinet contained one professing Jew and the British two. The other so-called commissars are all men of the second and lower ranks of officials belonging exclusively either to the civil service or the Soviet analog of our municipal life. They are probably fairly numerous, but in what may be called the second rank, they do not number more than 10 at the outside. The others may or may not be convinced Bolsheviks. They are servants of the state who may have many other motives for serving the Soviets than an enthusiasm for Lenin's politics. Not every head of a government department or chairman of a county council in England is today necessarily a Lloyd Georgian. Trotsky has in his war office and corps of officers probably as many ex-Tsarist officers, including 16 generals, as there are Jewish commissars in the whole Soviet administration. And yet nobody dreams of describing the Red Legions as a Tsarist army. These officers are probably not even Bolsheviks. If we could know their motives, we should probably find that they were not very widely different from those which actuate the Jewish commissars. What is contended is that normally the Jew is intensely antipathetic to Bolshevism, and that at the beginning of the revolution relatively very few Jews, even of those who are Jews by race only, rallied to the call of Lenin. That this situation has changed during the last year is not improbable. But with whom does the blame rest? If Jews have reluctantly turned towards Bolshevism, it is because they have been forced into it by the anti-Bolsheviks. They cannot but be alarmed by the persistency and passion with which the charge of Bolshevism is leveled at them, and the threats which come from all sides to avenge on their persons the sins of Lenin and Trotsky. They have had a bloody installment of the St. Bartholomew in the pogroms of the Polish borderlands and the Ukrainian plains. What wonder, then, if some of them, and they can only be relatively very few, turn for protection to the Soviets, especially in the lands where the Soviets rule. Nevertheless, their aversion from Bolshevism in theory and practice remains, and is indeed for the great majority of them insuperable. One word in conclusion. If some of the charges against the Jews which have been examined in the foregoing pages were not so utterly unfounded as they prove to be, Ample explanation and excuse might be found in the high and sustained tragedy of Jewish history. When in 1848 Ludwig Bern was reproached by a political colleague with the excessiveness of his revolutionary zeal, he replied, "I was born a slave, and hence I love freedom better than you do." 20 centuries of a terrible oppression has made of the Jews in Europe an element of no small importance in all the struggles for popular liberties, but throughout it all they have always remained a relatively conservative force. This is most strikingly exemplified by their career in the Russian Revolution. Human nature being what it is, it would not have been surprising if all of the Jews in Russia had become fanatical Bolsheviks. The extravagances of Bolshevism are the natural reaction against the cruelties of Tsarism, and the Jews suffered more bitterly from these cruelties than any other section of the sorely tried Russian people. And yet their innate moderation, what Disraeli rightly diagnosed as their ineradicable attachment to religion and property, has prevailed, and even among the lower classes, who were proletariized and driven to socialism by the infamous May laws, Bolshevism has found only few and reluctant recruits. The Jews, no doubt, have their defects, very much in the same way as Christians, but what Mr. Gladstone once called incivism is not one of them.